thank you for arriving here to the Westbury Hotel in Dublin for the Ireland United States alumni conversation around energy security in a world of disinformation. Yes, that is our title. I hope you have buckled your seats and you're all strapped in. We have some incredible speakers that are joining us here on this incredible topic, and just a huge warm welcome to everybody who's joined us from our European partners, everybody who's been across in the ENAM group. Delighted to have you involved tonight. My name is Chris M. Gordon. I am president of the Ireland United States Alumni Association, and it is my honour to welcome you all here. Every single year we double ourselves in being able to have incredible speakers who obviously tell us a little bit about their own background and experience, and then enlighten us about how it is that we should be dealing with these topics that affect every single part of us. However, it does rely a little bit on you. So I implore you, and I think our host, Shona Murray, will do this as well. Sometimes there's incredible people up on stage. There's incredible people here in the room tonight. We sincerely hope to hear from you. Your questions, your observations would be fantastic if you could please join in on our conversation. So, first off, how are we feeling? Good? Yeah, you see, it's just caffeine at this time of day. That's all that is. A couple of cookies thrown in, sugar. Listen, keep that energy. That's brilliant. Just to keep that energy, by the way, we have our conference, which will go on until roughly, hopefully, at 6:30. We've got an hour or so to go to the sidecar where they turn over the room, and then we welcome everybody back in. And if we'd like to have everybody here at 6:45 seated. Tonight we have our awards dinner, and we have one of our awardees here. Also, we will have Ambassador Cronin and Deputy Assistant Secretary Nicole Elkin will be joining us for dinner. So an incredible evening set for tonight. Thank you so much for making it your mission to be here, and thank you so much. Okay, a couple of things. It would be ridiculous if I didn't say this. It is so important for the Ireland United States Alumni Association to make sure that we are as part of a community as we can be, and that's about sharing the information that we have and a little bit more about it. I implore you today that you may have one of these. Everybody got one of these? Excellent. Actually, sorry, before I say it, these are fantastic little devices. They've got a little ringer tone at the side. See the ringer tone? Just please turn it down to the very bottom. But please do keep it on, because we would love if you use our @IrishUS alumni and hashtag IUSAconf23. Please do tweet at us. We will have some tweets and other social media going tonight. So if you could at least take one photograph. Perhaps there's something interesting that is you heard from our incredible speakers, but more importantly, we're trying to make sure that other people who are part of your network will be incredibly jealous that you're in the Westbury tonight. So that's the main reason for getting social media out. For tonight, we do have exceptional people who will be seated at the table. It's a bit of a free-for-all. There is one or two tables that are set, so just be mindful of that when we come back in, but we'll remind you at the evening start. Okay, in front of you, you have a sheet with some of our speakers. In my error, because I'm the one that does this, unfortunately, I have Alison O'Connor. Unfortunately, I have the wrong image. I don't know if you've noticed this, but apologies. I'm not going to say it to you. No, it didn't exist. I'm so sorry.
I hope it's someone good.
yeah. Just in case you're imposter syndrome or something. Forgive us. We're delighted to have such incredible speakers who Shona will invite up shortly. A couple of other things, if you wouldn't mind, please make sure that if you are able to take part in any of our conversations, do raise your voice, let everybody else hear. We do have some photographers and some videographers here as well that'll hopefully keep all of your incredible questions for posterity, so make it good. With that, thank you so much for being here, and I'm going to hand over to somebody who is thankfully an alumni and far more experienced at being able to stand up in front of rooms and discuss things. Somebody who is at the forefront of Irish media for the past number of years and has gone on then to be at the forefront of European media. Somebody who has been across the world in dispatches and correspondences from Congo and Iraq and Gaza and Israel, previously has been involved in so many different negotiations and conferences and a whole host of other things. We're delighted that she said yes, although I still don't know why. I'm so a former alumni, but also somebody who was on the board of the Ireland United States alumni. So something at least, hopefully we've continued in good vein, and you're proud of who we have been able to bring back today. It is my honour, and I hope you would be able to join me in a round of applause to welcome up who is going to be our moderator for the rest of the speakers. Please put your hands together for Ms. Shona Murray.
Thanks for that, Chris, and welcome back, everybody. As Chris said, we've got a brilliant panel for you this evening, and really so much to discuss, so I'll just get to it. I'm going to introduce them, and then maybe they're going to come up and speak for 5 minutes, then we'll get into the Q&A. And we'd love if you were to interact, and if you have some questions or comments for the panel, please, engage, because we'd love to hear from you. Just to tell you our panel, we have Mr. Kieran O'Quinn, who Kieran is works in international relations and peace processes, primarily in the Middle East. He's founder of Amanahar, a strategy consultancy that advises governments on policy and international relations, and he's former special advisor to the former Foreign Affairs Minister Dermot Ahern. We've got Pat Cox here, the former President of the European Parliament, who has extensive expertise in Ukraine, and I've also given him permission to mainly talk about Ukraine because he's been there around 70 times over the past 10, 12 years. He's been part of the Maidan marches, the various different presidents, and the obviously the war in Ukraine. Now, the last time he was in Ukraine was in September. He's consistently engaging with people there at the moment. So I'd love to hear from him on that. And of course, last but certainly not least, Alison O'Connor, journalist, broadcaster and author, political columnist with the Irish Examiner. So Pat, if you want to come up first, I think, and then we'll bring the other panellists up and then start a discussion. Thank you.
So good evening. It's great to be here. Thank you for the invitation. It's not that I was going to stick my head in a script, but I prepared some remarks on energy security, which was one of the elements of today's theme. But I have been given the permission of the moderator to jump this, so I'm going to set that to one side and talk a little bit about Ukraine, but I will connect it to energy security. Very quickly, me and Ukraine, which is not what I came to talk about, but just to locate it, I've been doing political work of one sort or another, I suppose you could call it political diplomacy, pro bono through the European Parliament in Ukraine since 2012. I've been on about 70 visits to Ukraine, as remarked, the most recent one in September during the war. And perhaps to honour a bit the energy security thing, I'm going to bring it into how I shaped the beginning of what I'm going to say to you. Vladimir Putin was appointed by the exiting president, Yeltsin, on the last day of 1999 and effectively took office for the new millennium. 2 years later, he was so interested in the internal political cuisine in Ukraine that he convinced the second-term president, Leonid Kuchma, to appoint a former criminal prisoner, a political operative, and a well-connected regional politician from Donetsk called Viktor Yanukovych to be the Prime Minister of Ukraine. And this was duly done with Kremlin support and connivance in year 2002. So if you're looking for this story, don't start on February 24th last. The second dimension in this, to hop, skip and jump through it very quickly, there was a presidential election due in 2004. The Kremlin, perhaps unwisely, got publicly involved in the campaign and the financing of the campaign for Yanukovych. His competitor was Viktor Yushchenko, who was, as happens in that part of the world, taken off the pitch for a certain period of time because he was poisoned. The election was fought. Yushchenko was way ahead in reputable opinion polls, but Yanukovych won according to the Central Election Commission. That led to outrage and what became known as the Orange Revolution. That was resolved by the Supreme Court of Ukraine, declaring that the election was null and void and having a new election, whereupon Yanukovych lost and Yushchenko won. Jump on to 2008, 2009. The Kremlin is plotting how to get Yanukovych back into the presidency. And here I do come to energy. They exported to Kyiv, as they did all over the post-Soviet region, cheap gas. It was one of the ways, if you were an energy junkie, to get your supply without having to pay too much. And that kept you in a zone of both political and energy dependency. And so in 2008 and spilling into 2009, Putin ramped up the energy pressure on Ukraine by cutting off all the gas supplies. That spilled over to freezing schools and hospitals and apartments, especially but not only in the EU member states of Romania, Bulgaria, and that led to enormous pressure by President Barroso of the European Commission on Yushchenko and his Prime Minister Yulia Tymoshenko to sort it out, whatever it takes. What it took in the end was eyeball to eyeball, two people in the room, about 2 a.m, early one morning, Vladimir Putin, Yulia Tymoshenko, out of which came a dirty deal that charged Ukraine per cubic metre of gas one of the highest prices in Europe and more than the rich Germany paid for each cubic metre of gas. Whereupon, even if you're not that smart, that football lands at your feet as a good politician. You have an open goal on energy prices, on people giving out about cost of living, on industry complaining about being shattered by energy prices, and you score the goal. And so Yanukovych won handsomely the 2010 presidential election. 2 years later, anticipating the 2014 presidential election, Yanukovych put his competitor Yulia Tymoshenko and others on ice by what Western jurists described as selective justice, which was the abuse of the justice system to rid yourself of your political enemies. And what was Tymoshenko imprisoned for? For the gas deal and its price. And so it's all part of a piece, and along came, so I'm really skipping along, I'm going to leave out all of the details. Along came this process of negotiating with the EU for an association and deep and free comprehensive free trade area agreement. It was due to be signed in Vilnius, in the capital of Lithuania, on the 28th of November of 2013. I had the privilege to sit in the second row and observe the great and the good going about their business on this. And when it came to the speaking turn of Yanukovych, he confirmed what we already knew: he wasn't going to sign. He flew home to Kyiv that night, and that was the night that Maidan started with students. It might have gone away, but the Berkut, the rough security services, beat them so hard, there was public outrage, and the public, not the students, came to Maidan. Then people thought, with the cold winter, it was minus 15 through periods of time during Maidan, we'll keep them home. It didn't stop them. And then people thought the Orthodox Christmas, which comes on the 7th of January, will kind of mark an end. It didn't stop. Then there was killings by the security services in early January, and then shocking killings of what they now call the Heavenly Hundred in their references to the people who died in Maidan or close to it in 2014. The upshot was that Yanukovych fled and things moved on. Now, I'm going to bring it back to energy against that background. What do we know from all of that? Russia is a petrostate, and Russia is prepared to weaponize energy at will. What we also know is in 2011, so 2 years or 2 and a bit years after the energy was weaponized against Ukraine, Nord Stream 1 opened as a separate Russian supply chain of gas into Germany and through German pipes to others in the European Union. Mr. Putin then observed all of this, and I would say when it came to Yanukovych fleeing, he took the opportunity, I'll come to the disinformation theme briefly, to classify everyone on Maidan as a neo-Nazi. That it was a Nazi coup d'etat against a genuine authority. And that propaganda has never gone away. And it is wholly embedded, especially in very aggressive, statist Russian propaganda today, but it's been around right from the beginning. If you look at photographs of Maidan at its peak, at the weekends when people were off work and came, I invite you to Google photographs, and you will see their families, you will see their husbands and wives, you will see their grandmothers and grandfathers, and you don't associate neo-Nazi rebellion with bringing your granny to Maidan. And so it's an utter lie if you go even and just follow the visual evidence. And so you have the weaponization of energy, the weaponization of disinformation, to marry your two themes coming together in this. You had the separatist movement in Donbass, which in part was a genuine reaction. If our guy has gone out of Kiev, we want more to be with Russian. But a large part of it was fomented by Russia itself. Then you had the chutzpah of the annexation of Crimea. In March, on the 18th of March of 2014, in the splendid St. George's Hall in the Kremlin, Putin came like a Russian emperor before the great and the good of Russian society and the Orthodox Church, and was treated to rounds of applause as if he was, as he likes to think, Catherine the Great, Peter the Great, or a more benign but still very powerful Joseph Stalin. And what happened after that is interesting, because if we look at, again, some of the responses, and I'll pick one strategic response. Germany has had a long period of Ostpolitik, of developing its relations with Russia, and for good historic reasons. Nazi Germany did awful things and has been trying to right that wrong. Mrs. Merkel followed an established German policy. She didn't invent it, but she followed it in the German Wandel durch Handel, which is change through trade. And that would then soften all the rough edges in relationships. And so she went ahead after Crimea was annexed and signed off on Nord Stream 2. So if you're Vladimir Putin, stroke Peter the Great with your delusional ideas, willing to weaponize energy, but realizing the soft underbelly of European dependency, and this doubling the dependency after you've shown what you will do by the annexation of Crimea and the war in Donbass, is not a big surprise, even if you're a slow learner, for a guy to figure, I got away with that, I pocketed, what next? And so in a certain way, inadvertently, I'm sure, not expecting it, I'm sure, we actually, and the whole West did this, I'm just sticking with the EU example, but it's transatlantic. We all had a bit of this cake in terms of the baking. He picked the signals, and his actions got even bolder. And now we're in that confrontational space. We don't know what the end will be. The one thing I want to say then, closing out on that energy piece, there's a lot more to be said on Ukraine, a lot more to be said on disinformation. But in that little thread of continuity, Putin has been obsessed from the very beginning with controlling and managing Ukraine, directly or indirectly. Putin has been willing as a petrostate to weaponize energy, and he's done it more than once. The EU in particular, and Germany especially, was willing to send a signal of deeper dependency on someone that you might think you shouldn't depend on at all. But now as we look at new sources, there's certainly a richer trade transatlantically. I park it because that will happen in ordinary commercial conditions. But replacing slightly democratic autocracies with a supply chain from slightly constitutional monarchies is itself not necessarily a recipe for resilient and secure supply. And if I threw in a few other geopolitical bits, we're all walking on eggshells with Iran. There's one bit of our diplomacy doesn't want Iran to have a nuclear weapon, and we try to keep the door open. There's another bit disgusted by the repressive response to the recent civil unrest. There's annoyance and deep upset at the supply of drones and rockets from Iran to Russia. If something went wrong in that wider region, with Iran as a trigger, Iran has the chokehold on the Strait of Hormuz, which is the way in and out in the narrow neck of the Gulf of Persia, Gulf of Oman region. So our energy security stuff is still, just on the balance, and it's pretty tough. And as regards the energy thing, what we know from the Russian war, inflation shot up. It has all of the social and political consequences we know, which I won't develop at this point in terms of speaking time. Has it gone away because the price has come down a bit? The answer is we don't know. China is post-COVID. Its economic takeoff has started again. It is a huge net energy importer. It's bound to have an impact on energy pricing. We don't know the outcome or the timing of the end of the war in Ukraine. If it's still on next winter, it mightn't be a benign hotter winter like it was this year. So we're not out of the woods on that. So in terms of security, you look at availability of supply and affordability. And on those two themes, I would say we've a long way to go before we're in a settled state. And I haven't mentioned a word about greening, which is my passion, but we might take that on transitional energy systems on the panel. Thank you for your attention.
Good evening. My name is Kieran O'Quinn. I work in Oman, I work on Yemen, I work on Iran, and I work on Palestine. So some of these issues, the Straits of Hormuz and places like that, I know them well, and I know the precarious position we're in. For Ireland and Europe, energy security means decarbonisation in the medium and long term. Decarbonisation is really revolutionary. It's going to break the bonds of dependency which have shaped the 20th century and the first 20 years of this century. And there will be big winners. Hopefully we'll be one of the winners, but there'll be big losers. And some of those losers, countries which are producers, because the geopolitical world is divided essentially in the 20th century into those who produce oil and those who have to buy oil. And for those who produce oil, some of them in the Gulf and the GCC, some of them are now moving towards green hydrogen and things like this, and they know they have to have a post-carbon world and they're moving, but some won't. And as Pat said, some of our friends in Russia will use this information and everything they can to prolong that transition, because every day that transition takes longer is money in their pockets. So for someone who works in the area of peace processes and climate change in areas like this, my own assessment and the assessment of anyone essentially who works on this is the coming years with this transition will have war, will have conflict, kinetic and non-kinetic, informational, soft, strong, but it won't be pretty. And this is the area I work in. I'm the head of mission. I'm a diplomat in Oman. I run the last standing part of the Middle East peace process, an old thing from 1995, from the Madrid process before Oslo. It's the only place on earth where Palestine, Israel and Jordan work together, and we work on climate change. And we have a mandate from 11 states, including the United States, Japan, Korea and Germany. The mandate is to be a model organisation for states that seek to use transboundary environmental issues in the service of a peace process. And as you can imagine, this is delicate work and quiet work, although I'm talking about it here, because it's Ireland, we're far away. But in the Middle East, and these governments, more than our own governments, have understood for a long time the importance of energy to their systems. In the Middle East, water is 100% now a function of energy. Most water in the GCC, 90-something% of it comes from desalination. If you don't have energy, you don't have water. If you don't have water for 48 hours, that's the amount of reserve there are, you all die. If you don't have cooling, air conditioning, you can't live there. If it's 52, 53 degrees in the summer, you just can't survive. So water, food, energy water, food, life is an absolute function of energy in the Middle East. And that's not to mention places like Gaza, which have no water, which need to build desalination plants really, really urgently. And at the moment, they don't have gas for those plants. They're using diesel, which is very silly. So in the Middle East, water is a function of energy, food is a function of energy, and security is a function of energy. And Ukraine has brought this home to Europe, that so it was in the Middle East in the past and up to today, so it is in Ukraine. Because Europe's dependency on Russian oil, not all of Russia, but in general, European dependency on Russian oil, is Putin's deterrence. It is his power. It has stocked his treasury. It has bought his weapons. We are the cause of that. The war in Ukraine is a function of European dependency on Russian oil and gas. It has to be broken. There is no way around that. And European energy security and ultimately our strategic autonomy will come from decarbonisation. If we don't have, the 20th century was formed by the idea that Europe didn't have oil. Okay, Europe didn't have oil, so that meant everything. Europe had to, the Brits and the French, their colonies in the early part of the 20th century was all about that. The Suez Crisis, when Suez happened, it means European powers didn't have east of Suez the power to chase hydrocarbons anymore. In Iran, the imposition of the Shah was because of oil and gas. Our entire 20th century has been forged by this reliance on oil and gas, and we're going to have to break it for European strategic autonomy. This has huge implications for Ireland. We're not very good at long-term strategy, and we're not very good at building big things. We don't have a metro. We're the only European capital, apart from Luxembourg, I think, that doesn't have a metro. We're not good at this sort of thing. And there's lots of reasons for that, and we have to start taking into account. We have this culture of slow policy incrementalism, and that's for a number of reasons. There's no bad person. We have a really good civil service. But we have a system of PRSTV, which means that our politicians look at the operational and the tactical, not at the strategic, right? And when you have a strategic gap over 20, 30, 40 years, the civil service have to move in and fill that gap, which means that your strategic big picture stuff are being written by civil servants who will incrementally move forward in a reasonable and rational way. Our centralism, we don't have a decentralised system, which means a local becomes national. We have an ability in all our history to cut and paste from the British first and then from Brussels, which means the blade of policy is dulled. And our cosseting geography between Britain and the United States has meant that we've never had to think or spend money on security or defence policy. So we're not in a great place going forward. But if you look at what happened during COVID and all of that, we've seen the state can do good things. And we've a good civil service. So the solution to this as we go forward is actually inclusion, is to broaden out the public space where universities, think tanks, organisations like your own are proactively brought into the conversation, brought into the system. In the United States and the State Department, every department has AAAS fellows. They're intelligent people from the universities who are brought in to help all that sort of stuff we need to proactively do. Admit our failures and try and move forward and fix them. So the old way is over, and we need to learn to do big projects and big strategies fast. We're not good at it. We need to admit that. And in doing that, in doing the transition, we face not only disinformation from states and people who will oppose the transition, but magical thinking amongst people who want the transition to happen. There's a lot of really big problems in making the carbon transition. Storage technology is still rubbish. There's nowhere to park a gigawatt of energy and take 80% out of it in 2 days. It's just that technology hasn't arrived yet. Issues of grid interconnection, we're very bad at it. The world isn't very, very good at it. And just problems with windmills, problems with solar, problems with all that. I worked in the Department of Energy years ago, and you'd have journalists ringing 3 times a week saying they've 150% of their energy is from Denmark. Why can't we do that? Well, Denmark is interconnected with Scandinavia, so they've an infinite amount of hydroelectricity from Scandinavia. So when the windmill stops, you just get energy in a nanosecond from Scandinavia. If you produce too much energy, in Ireland you turn the windmill off, and there you can just sell it down into Hamburg and Bremen into the German market. They're totally and utterly interconnected. For us to do that, we have to have multiple amounts of interconnection. These are huge projects that we haven't even begun to think about it. So we need to be clear about all these problems, accept them, have inclusion in our policy system where we're bringing in the good and the great and international networks and all that to help us. The other thing, we've 2 big things we have to really question. One is we have developed a policy, it was announced by the last Taoiseach, that we would not have any domestic gas. We would no longer drill for domestic gas. Now, if our strategy to decarbonise includes 4 or 5 gas turbine plants and includes a realisation that we will need natural gas, we should be free to make a simple call. If you do a 20-year contract with the United States or with Canada, They have to still get that gas out of the ground. You have to liquefy it. You use huge amounts of carbon to liquefy it. You have to put it on a boat. You use huge amount of carbon to get it to the boat to Ireland. You then have to de-liquefy it again, more energy. And there's a factor of 5 to 10 on the amount of carbon of just getting it out of the ground. I'm not saying you just get it out of the ground. I'm saying you get an Excel sheet and you do the cost of the two, and you do the carbon cost of the two, and you make a strategic call for your state. So you don't make magical thinking pronouncements. We're not going to do that without doing it. The second one is our security strategy. We have two options. The status quo is a disgrace. We cannot... we have lots and lots and lots of telecommunication cables. We will have an awful lot of energy cables under our sea, which will power not only Ireland but a lot of Europe. We do not have the capacity to monitor them. We do not have the capacity to see what's in our skies. We do not have the capacity to see in our seas. We have two options, and there's a lovely debate, and there's been great reports on it. That's good. We have the non-aligned option, which is to do what Sweden used to do and spend around 1%, 1.5% of your GNP on a military. It's to spend a lot of money on conflict resolution and soft power to have a good image of yourself internationally, and that works. The other one is to join NATO, which would be quite simple. International relations theory will tell you if you want to freeload, it's better to freeload inside a big group rather than outside on your own. They're the two options, and we have to do one or the other, but we really have to do it. If you remember Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy years ago, when the guy from Portugal, they came in and they were debriefing him, they said, "How did you get in?" He said, "Through a soft route through Dublin." It hasn't changed. It's exactly the same today as it was there. It was then. The last one then is social inclusion. The transition to decarbonisation is going to be rough. It's going to be really rough. There will be winners and there will be people in rural Ireland who, you know, you've got your oil tank, you've got your breeze block house, and we need to have a state that's able to look really quick and react in a COVID-style way really quick to this, because social exclusion, and I won't talk about the disinformation bit, but social exclusion, when you do have disinformation, it'll go along the seams in a society. That's what they will go for. And it'll be New Irish and Old Irish. It'll be North-South, Protestants and Catholics. It'll be anything that drives populism, that drives people to go, we're not doing that transition thing, we're staying as we are. And if we stay as we are, that helps Russia, that helps the old system. So thanks very much for listening to me.
Good evening, everyone. I am a journalist and a commentator, so I cover generally politics and current affairs. And I suppose it's an understatement to say that the last few years we have lived in very interesting times. And when you have my job, it has required becoming very knowledgeable on certain subjects really very, very quickly. And energy security would have been one of those subjects, let me tell you. I knew that I lived in a country where if you turned on the light, it generally came on. We didn't have too many power cuts. And, we were hoping to, as Kieran has just talked about, increasingly decarbonise. And we had our political issues with that. But I suppose this time last year, we were coming up to all suddenly faced with the reality of energy security and the politics that surrounded that. And as I suppose I'm going to talk more domestically in terms of trying to, something that faces you every day and that you virtually take for granted, to it suddenly being something that's very under threat, and that not only under threat, it was also going to make a very big difference possibly to people's standard of living, to people being able to survive the winter. And it was very difficult here to get answers, to ring some of what you might consider the usual people and say, where are we left as a country? What might happen next winter? Will the lights go out? We are mainly supplied from here through the UK. And I had more conversations than I can remember with people within government. And we have a coalition, the three-party coalition government. And nobody could tell you exactly what might happen. To be fair to them, they didn't know. But most of our energy, a lot of it comes through the UK. Nobody could tell you what might happen if the UK themselves got into trouble and if they decided that they were going to either turn us down or turn us off. Or even the fact that it came down through Scotland and through the north of Ireland, people would say then that, oh, well, look, that's not going to happen because then they would have to turn off Northern Ireland, which is part of the UK. The next person would tell you that indeed they could. Sure, wasn't it just a case of one pipe going this way, one going the other way, and you just flicked a switch? And to be honest, perhaps it's a sign that I didn't probe deeply enough. It was difficult to know whether people just really weren't sure or whether they were obfuscating on this matter. And I suppose there's also an obligation when you're in government at that time, is that you don't want to panic your population, and you're also uncertain. And even that we talked about this winter, as we know, has throughout Europe hasn't been that bad in terms of temperatures. There was all the talk. I mean, I remember being really surprised to hear before last summer that how we would get on this winter depended on how hot it was throughout Europe and how much people had their air conditioning on. But in June, I went on a trip to Brussels and had a number of briefings on the EU Commission. And I suppose it was fascinating from that point of view to see it on a wider European basis, and even to see that the Irish Commissioner there, Mairead McGuinness, giving a briefing to Irish journalists and basically saying what our politicians weren't saying here, and it made headlines back here, where she said, like, Ireland, because of its very particular situation, I think she was referring in that instance to our dependence, the fact, as Kieran said, we're cosseted geographically, but we are very much on the edge of Europe, that we could be in trouble. And you could see, again, that situation, on mainland Europe, you were going to have far more dependence on each other, but far more closeness geographically. And I suppose the bottom line is that because of the mildness of this winter, none of what was being the worst of what was being worried about wasn't coming to pass. And if you think about the information or disinformation that was going around then, I remember at one briefing being kind of surprised to hear we had signs in the supermarkets saying that you could, in one or two supermarkets, you could only buy 2 bottles, I think it was, of vegetable oil, because obviously at the time we were all talking about wheat from Ukraine, nothing being able to come out of Ukraine, and that these sort of things were restricted. But the briefing basically was, there is enough food in the world to feed everybody. There will be no restrictions. It's a case of getting the food to people who need it at a price that they can afford it. However, obviously on energy, it was a totally different ball game. And I suppose it was an eye-opener for me, despite my years in journalism, of realising that we were being, in a way, cosseted with what we were being told at home by a government, I suppose, not necessarily wanting to face up to the fact of some decisions that haven't been taken in the past, but also not wanting to panic and trying to, I suppose, work more from week to week rather than being able to predict, for instance, what was going to happen in November. On another level, you were listening to people being interviewed here, and you might be listening to somebody on the radio and think, God, that guy really knows what he's talking about. He knows all about energy supply, where it's coming from, how dependent we are. And then you'd realise at the end, this was someone who was representing the industry. You know, so I've never come across, there are subjects obviously, but I found it a subject that it was very difficult to parse, or you had to be very aware of who you were hearing it from, where you were hearing it from. Quite obviously, the traditional oil industries have really made hay out of this period in terms of pushing the idea that they, even though they're seen as dirty fuel now, that they must still be around, they must still be dependent on. We've seen what's happened. We've seen the protests in Germany, the reopening of or the dependence on coal mines there. So it was I suppose at the heart of that you have like where do we stand in terms of our energy security and who was telling the truth. And I can kind of honestly say that even at this point, because I guess we haven't reached the crisis, and it would vary when you would hear ministers or ask ministers, is there a prospect that the lights are going to go out this winter in Ireland? And they would say it was always a very slightly conditional answer. So it always left you with this very slight worry that that indeed that could happen. And we were never quite told either that you were told that, like, again, this was something we were told in the EU at those briefings, that you would, like, that hospitals would be protected, domestic settings would be protected, factories would be the first things to go, that each country had a list. Again, not something that that had yet been announced back here. Now we have a situation, I guess, where after a mild winter, the EU gas supplies are in really good shape. That now it's next winter that we're worrying about. In the midst of that, you have a government that's trying to push through, which both previous speakers have mentioned, a climate agenda. The coalition government here, 3 parties. The Green Party trying to push a climate agenda. The other 2 parties, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, saying absolutely we're right behind you and we want to go all the way to renewables. But it's the issue, and again, Kieran would talk here about the civil service and about how trying to do things at a strategic level and getting things to move. There is a huge amount of wind energy that would go a massive way towards supplying what is required in Ireland, stuck in our planning system. And when you're stuck in the Irish planning system, it's a serious Hotel California job. And the government has announced that there's going to be new laws, but even within that, where they're going to be less objections, that if it's going to something happening in your neighbourhood, residents associations, all of that sort of thing. But the complication there is that the Green Party, ironically, are saying that they are not comfortable with that, with taking away, sorry, I keep hitting that microphone, with taking away people's right to object. So it has struck me a lot that this is a massive opportunity. I know even from personal experience and speaking to people, to friends and to family, that in the last couple of months, even around the house at home, I think we're all cutting down. Everybody is being more careful. Not my teenagers, but I'm certainly doing enough shouting at them to try and get there. So that from that point of view, for the planet, there is, as I mentioned, the chance that it will be used as an excuse for us to slide backwards and for the fossil fuel industry to get in there. But I do think that looking forward, maybe 10 years from now, that one of the good things out of this war, if you look at where politics is at, I think even at a national or a European level, this will have given it the push. The realisation of, Pat spoke about German policy, and when you look at it now, in many ways it was, and there is a lot of historical reason for why things were done the way they were done, but really it was as plain as the nose in your face, the way that things were going. And that hopefully this dreadful war in Ukraine, that the good thing out of it will be far more eager, far more on it. You see that even at EU level in terms of trying collective bargaining, in terms of next year. I know that there's not next year, in the next couple of months, the Commission is bringing forward an electricity market reform. They're going to delink the price of gas. Again, something that so few people knew, that in terms of price of gas and renewables being linked, because renewables are obviously far cheaper to produce than gas. So that I think from that point of view, we're looking at things that are positive. And the other thing I suppose that I was thinking of, you talk about here in Europe and in the States, and again, it was my own experience. I was there in September, and the notifications were still turned on my phone, and I was visiting some friends, and there was headlines coming up like from Ireland, things like how much it's going to cost you to make a cup of tea by boiling your kettle this winter. And in the States, my friends were oblivious. Now, obviously, they have a totally different energy scenario. They're facing the same climate crisis, clearly. But it was like living in an entirely different world, between the world of what was happening in Europe and the EU. Now, obviously, Europe was dependent on Russia in a way that, for fuel, in a way that the US wasn't. But it was an entirely different existence. And I guess the other thing, the title is In a World of Disinformation. But we saw, and I know there was an awful lot of disinformation in COVID, but certainly in Ireland, the mainstream news channels, newspapers, their websites, the clicks, the viewing for the nightly news went through the roof because people wanted genuine information. And it's my experience that is similar with energy. Not just because people are concerned about what's happening in Ukraine, of course they are, and Irish people have responded really well, but because there is a direct cost of living angle to it, I find it heartening that people generally are very well informed, that they have gone out of their way to, they know, not unlike myself, people know an awful lot more now about their energy, about where it's coming from, and about who you should and shouldn't rely upon, and even asking questions about why wind energy and other renewables like that haven't been progressed a lot further, and that then puts the government under pressure to do something about that. Thank you.
They were all brilliant pieces, so there's so much to discuss. And before I kind of focus on Ukraine, I was going to ask Alison and Kieran a little bit about the causative point you're both making around Ireland's geography. And, you know, Kieran, in particular, you were saying you either join NATO or we go the Swedish route, which is non-formally aligned, but use soft power diplomacy, which is kind of what Ireland likes to perceive it does with its development programme. But really, the context in Ireland is that there's no discussion, no even appetite for discussion around how Ireland would beef up its security and defences, is there?
We'll stop back. Yeah. No, there isn't. And I mean, it's strange in the last couple of days listening to German Chancellor Scholz and talking about the tanks, and you realise that every country has its baggage and every country has its own cultural things, and we all think we're unique, and exceptionalism is as big in this country as it is in any other country. When we, you know, if you think of the Battle of Waterloo, 33% of the troops were Irish. We had a military history up until the 1920s, and when we were negotiating with the British, we didn't want to be part of the empire. They said, absolutely fine, no problem at all. You'll have to be neutral then. And we said, fine. They would look after the seas, and that was grand. And it's still that way today, you know. If anything happens, I mean, that's who we'll have to turn to. That's how it is today. By 1939, it was only 20 years after the Black and Tans had been in Dublin. So the plain people of Ireland said, we don't want to be in anything that they're involved in. That's understandable. After the war, there was no big opposition. I mean, we did talk to the Americans, we did talk to NATO, decided not to, I think, because of Britain in the north. We went to the Americans and said, let's have our own little thing between Ireland and America. And America said, absolutely not. And it went on. And as the years have gone in, this is, you know, it's great for our self-image. We were very, very poor. We didn't really have to do anything. And so it has grown, and it's now an article of faith and all of that. The key thing to do is if you do go the Swedish route, this year, before they're in NATO, they will spend 1.49% of their GDP on weapons and on military and all of that. We spend 0.3%, okay? So what we do simply isn't an option. So it's one of those sacred cows we have, unfortunately, and we should be able to talk. And I think for most people, you could do the old Finnish or Swedish way on the route to NATO, or not do the NATO thing forever. But the status quo is something we just don't even talk about.
Alison, I mean, it's not so much disinformation as it is misinformation. I mean, you're in the Dáil, the Irish Parliament, the whole time. And talk us through some of the lack of discussions around policy, possibly engaging in what is really very important for the future of the state.
I mean, I guess you could almost call it an accidental neutrality, and that it's something that Irish people only on certain occasions, such as when the war began in Ukraine, will actively think about neutrality. And to my mind, our level of discussion on our neutrality is very immature, actually. An Irish person will, a lot of Irish people will reflexively tell you, I want us to hang on to our neutrality. But if you were to go deeper in that and say, well, do you mean political neutrality? Do you mean military neutrality? Like, for instance, I think most people were happy that when the war broke out, that our government most certainly wasn't politically neutral, that our Taoiseach, the Prime Minister, stood very firmly in solidarity with Ukraine and stood very firmly in solidarity with the EU in terms of Ukraine as well, and that we were very careful about what it was, what form that support took, because if you are to mention to many Irish people the whole idea, they're comfortable with that, and they were comfortable with that and the idea of money and I suppose what we might call the softer supports. But if you start mentioning tanks and artillery and all of that, that's where the comfort or the discomfort comes in. But yet, people will not really be able to articulate maybe why or what the levels of that are or what they would wish to allow. Traditionally, Fine Gael, who was one of the coalition parties, is seeing as much more, if you'll pardon the pun, gung-ho on all of this, and are seen to have maybe in some ways used what's happened over the last year to their advantage in terms of the public debate on it. But what has been proposed, it has been proposed that we would have a citizens' assembly. We've had citizens' assembly on other issues. There's one going on at the moment on climate and biodiversity, where a bunch of citizens are chosen who come together. They're chosen by an opinion poll company. I personally think it's a really good idea. I've sat through. We had one on abortion as well, as to whether we would allow abortion in this country, and it's deliberative democracy, and where people decide. There's a lot of expert speakers come in. There are discussions amongst all of the citizens, and they're led in those discussions, and at the end there's votes. So it's been suggested that that's something that we need to do. It was on neutrality. It was also said that it was in the weeks really after the war started that then was not the time, and I agree, then was not the time. But it's kind of gone on the back burner now, and there was also some opinion polls subsequently, and I think a lot of people in government were quite surprised that the levels were quite low, actually. I'm trying to remember the figures now. I'd say it was under 50% of people who wanted us to no longer be neutral. And where that lands right at the moment, I suspect if you did an opinion poll tomorrow, it would be even less. And we don't have a date for the Citizens' Assembly. And I don't know whether it's going to be something that gets put on the long finger if the war were to finish relatively soon, because I think that in a lot of ways it suits the Irish political system for this to be something that this is a nettle that isn't grasped if it doesn't have to be.
But I mean, just on the immaturity around the discussion, because there are politicians who just won't have the discussion, and some who are saying neutral by all means, yet they don't have a solution for the imminent crisis that faces us if we don't have any security policy.
No, but you see, we have and the one thing we will always talk, what an Irish politician will always speak about is how we're brilliant peacekeepers. And the work we've done with the UN, it's kind of don't hit me now with the UN peacekeeping force in my arms and force me to discuss our neutrality. And I do have some sympathy, because it's like I said, if you have a population that don't really know themselves, like they think, it's motherhood and apple pie, I really like this whole neutrality thing, but I'm not sure exactly why or how I might bend that or change it. I suppose it got, of a generation, the biggest challenge to that was the invasion of Ukraine. And yet after the first couple of weeks, it's been put in abeyance again. But I will also say that when you live on an island that is literally sort of on the absolute periphery of Europe, and that on the other side you have the US, it does give you a very different geographical perspective. I've lived myself in, if you spend some time in Brussels or lived in Paris, it's very different. You feel at the heart of Europe, and even the media and the way everything is reported is different. Now, Ireland gives very high in Eurobarometer surveys. This is how the European Union measures all the different countries and how all the different populations in the different countries, what they think of the EU, what they think the EU is doing, all of that. Ireland, the people who are asked in Ireland always scored those things very highly. But again, you have to look at that it's from a perspective of us being on the edge of Europe, and that's not going to change. We are where we are.
Pat, so, I mean, you give us that trajectory of the past 20 years where we had Putin, Yanukovych, the Orange Revolution, and the other, who's the Yushchenko, isn't it? Yeah, Yushchenko, of course. And then Maidan, and we are now in the situation where there's a totalitarian war being waged on Europe. Talk us through what's at stake here for the rest of Europe, for Ireland especially. Well, in particular, I suppose, but also Ukraine.
Well, what's at stake, I think you have, not exclusively in Russia, but Russia is now the front end of this, a challenge by increasingly self-confident autocracies to believe that they have an alternative worldview and model. And so to start at a high level, the challenge is to the principles on which the post-war foundation was based through the United Nations Charter, one of whose most important and early articles is to respect the sovereign territory of another member state of the United Nations. You have all the issue about nuclear non-proliferation. Ukraine was, of course, a Soviet republic. It was the most westerly Soviet republic, and therefore was the repository of the largest Western targeted part of the Soviet nuclear arsenal. After its independence, the United States and others, as nuclear powers, feared informal proliferation, black market proliferation. And so they negotiated with Ukraine to hand back its arsenal to Russia. They agreed it in Budapest in 1994 and signed a Budapest Memorandum where the United States, the United Kingdom, underwrote with Russia to respect the sovereign territory of Ukraine if they handed back the weapons. I suspect if they kept a few of them in haystacks, that Mr. Putin might have been less ready to have a go at them. And so the nuclear non-proliferation message is not helped by what is happening in Ukraine. A third dimension, as we've seen, is this vast reservoir of agricultural production. The best soil in the world is called loam, and 40% of the loam in the world is in Ukraine, which was rightly known as the breadbasket of the Soviet Union at the time. And we've seen the implications for food prices and the actual and potential risks of shocking food poverty and even death as a result of famine, a consequence from that. We've discussed the energy one, so I won't go back to it, but we've had the extraordinary explosion in energy prices, be calmed compared to their height, but still there. I think if I spin the perspective a little bit, Mr. Putin took his gamble for a combination of history, neo-imperialism, greater Russian vision on one part, and stewing in grievances about real or perceived wrongs from the West and elsewhere. Annoyed about a presumption of a policy of containment by NATO or the United States. And he decided he's going to break out of all of that, give us a black eye, and teach everyone a lesson. I think what he's actually done already, so whatever the outcome of the war is, strategically he's the biggest loser. He has lost on NATO. He's going to have a bigger NATO, and a more determined and united NATO than it's been since the collapse of the Berlin Wall, as a direct consequence of what he did. He will have 1,340 more kilometres of border with Finland when it joins NATO that he didn't have, irrespective of the eventual security guarantees for Ukraine. He has turned Russia, I believe, ultimately, and it will be the post-Putin era that will reveal this, into a long-term, second-best client state of a rampant China if things hold in the centre in China, which may not have been his intention, but I think will be his effect. He has woken up the European Union, to quote Vladimir Lenin, who talked about decades where nothing happens and days where decades happen. Within days of his invasion, the European Union, which has faffed about on common security and defence policy, ponied up £500 million of a defence fund to start sending arms to Ukraine. It's nothing like what the United States mobilised, but it's something they couldn't do for decades, and they did it in 72 hours. Olaf Scholz has taken a bit longer with the tanks to get there, but Scholz, they started off the incredible thing of sending 5,000 hats, military hats for Ukraine. But in fairness, since then, the Germans have spent over 12 billion euros in defence-related expenditure for Ukraine. But one of the big lessons, I think, also comes, and I'll come back to the Irish angle, I think as regards the transatlantic relationship, which was severely tested by the Trumpist American First policy, and which could yet be severely tested by a similar evolution of US politics. Under Biden, the transatlantic relationship has become extraordinarily strong in the line of its historic weight. And if you lived in Vilnius, because you made a very good point, Alison, we live kind of far away out on the edge. If you lived in Vilnius, if you lived in Riga, if you lived in Tallinn, if you lived in Warsaw, you would have a different foreboding about the imminent real threat to yourself and your sovereign integrity than if you live on an island behind an island off the west coast of the European continent. And in those places, they've had to wrestle with this issue of strategic security in Europe. President Macron has talked a lot, and there's been a lot of conversation around the notion of European strategic autonomy, and that may or may not come about in some form. But I think if you live in one of what I call the frontline states in danger, strategic security means, when the bottom line comes, relying on the arsenal of democracy, which is the United States. And the measure of that is look at the amount that the United States put into Ukraine, which is much more than the sum of all the other parts. And so that is a reality, whatever happens in the evolution of security. Here in Ireland, on the security question that has been debated in a very interesting way, I am a veteran of a multiplicity of European referendum campaigns in Ireland. One of the issues that is always exploitable in a no campaign is that if you vote yes, we lose our neutrality. And it has traction and it has pulling power.
And that our sons will be recruited to a European army.
Yes, and it's always there. I mean, we've had, I've forgotten, 10, 12 referenda. It's always there. I remember campaigning in Tullamore in a shopping centre on a quiet afternoon, and there was a grandmother wheeling two twins in a buggy. I made my pitch, and she said, but I don't want these two fighting and dying in a European war. And rather than engage in a whole thing about security policy, I pointed out, which is true, that the Irish government had negotiated a protocol that built a wall between us and any European security policy, and the protocol has the weight of an article of the treaty. So I set aside whether we should be in or out. We had a wall to say we couldn't go in even if we voted yes, and anyway they weren't doing the thing that the woman was afraid of. I asked her where did she get the information, and she said she'd heard an expert debating it on the local radio. So information, disinformation, you can tell me. But this was used all the time And I recall remarking in debates on the radio here that the no campaigners were really lucky that Ireland's neutrality wasn't like virginity, because we kept losing it every few years, every time we had a referendum. We've recently had a security review. I won't go into it, but it was pre-war in Ukraine. If you were doing it again, I think it would be more acute. There were 3 layers of how we would deal with it to do with spending: low, middle, and high. And we opted for the middling one, whatever it would be. We are going to have a general election in, the middle distance, and 12, 18 months, whatever it will be. I don't know who will form the government, but certainly the Sinn Féin party will be a bigger component in the next Dáil than they are in this Dáil. And you don't have to scratch hard to get their answer on this neuralgia, the neutrality neuralgia. So do I see Ireland strategically having needs? You spelled them out very well, to do with underground cables and all that. Absolutely yes. Do we have strategic interest to protect all of that? Absolutely yes. Will we have a strategy to do what you might need to do? Absolutely not. That is my presumption.
Can I just add very briefly, though, that with all the talk and the acuteness of it just after the invasion and what was going to happen and what were we going to do, a year has passed and we did what we did in terms of our soft approach, and the EU tolerated that. So we didn't really come under any pressure from our EU partners. So that's the other thing that stands in the favour of our government allowing the status quo to exist.
But the EU, I mean, the big proof of it is Brexit. The EU is a voluntary engagement. The difference between old imperial Europe and the European Union is that the European Union, at the beginning and at the end, is a union of choice. And when you negotiate your protocol, as we did, the choice is made in law. Even if Europe wanted to tell us we should buck up, we could tell them where to go, because our protocol says we can choose. So we did spend money through the European Defence Fund with the proviso that it should be on the humanitarian and medical part of the funding stream, rather than on the arms and armaments part. And I think that's real risk. I think the idea of, you mentioned it, Alison, of holding another citizens' assembly on this could be very helpful, because the citizens' assembly have released energies around gay marriage or abortion or those things which were pent up but couldn't, to use your point about strategic inability to move. They deblocked or unblocked that. I don't know what the outcome would be, but if there is an unblocking, that will be the leading route more likely than political parties.
Do we have the time for that, though, Ciara? I mean, that seems to be quite a long way away, but whereas our challenges seem to be quite imminent. I mean, joining NATO is just, to me, a pipe dream, if you look at the context we're in now, and obviously the blockage between Finland and Sweden and so on. So what possibly can be the right way of engaging this? And Pat mentioned we are supporting the Peace Fund, and we are engaged in common foreign and security policy.
Well, I think our big problem is, if you sum up our defence policy today, it's we have lads in the lab. We have lads in the lab is not a deterrent. It's just not a deterrent. And you hear people saying, well, when I show my passport somewhere, they smile and they say, you're lovely, and that's wonderful. It's not a deterrent, and that's the problem. So I think what we'll do is we'll have an Irish solution. We will allow a deepening through Europe, as long as we will come up against protocols, though, at some stage. We will buy the minimum possible to protect. So we will have a radar system that allows us for the first time ever to see what's actually in the sky. We will have a few more boats, and that's essentially it. And we will try to maybe get some jets, so we don't have to rely 100% on the RAF. But if whoever's coming into the airspace comes quick, we'll still have to phone them, because whatever we buy won't be able to get there quick enough. So I think we will incrementally just move forward slowly, and have an Irish solution to an Irish problem. There's no bang whiz join NATO. I don't think that's going to happen. No. You could make an argument for the Swedish, the old Swedish approach. I mean, when I worked in the Department of Foreign Affairs, that was very much the way we wanted to go. We set up a conflict resolution unit in the department. We had allocated a lot of money to spend. Sweden this year last year spent around 80 million on helping peace processes around the world and working on it. So we spend a couple of 100,000.
I want to just move on from this, but just one other thing that I was going to ask you, Alison, because we did have two major issues recently. We had the Russians engaging in military exercises off Cork, which didn't happen, but could have happened. And then we had the HSC cyber attack, which was done by Russia. So that wasn't enough to scare people. In fact, I think people made a bit of a joke about the fishermen, which they were brave, but you know.
But I think you have to think about this even in terms of climate. When something very bad happens in terms of climate, or we see, that there is really bad bushfires or flooding, where and again, this has to be relatively close to home. I'm sure there were a number of people very distraught in recent weeks, for instance, that the weather has been so mild throughout much of Europe that a lot of the ski slopes had melted. So people's ski holidays. So I remember years ago being in Australia, many years ago, and watching a media programme, and it's a little crude, but they used a phrase that's always struck with me, that a murder in your street is worth 2 in the next. So that when things are closer to home and you can identify with them, that's when you're going to worry about them and think, do we need to take action here? So you're right. When we heard that, I was just about to mention that the Russians had threatened military exercises off our coast, and everybody realised how literally naked we were, not just in terms of defence, but even, Ciara mentioned radar, that we wouldn't even be able to see what they were doing. You couple that then with the war happened, and it was all suddenly this was happening, and it was virtually not quite on our doorstep, but nobody knew, how quickly was it going to move. So I think that people have just put that off, and I appreciate that Pat said there's a lot of things in place within protocols, things that are agreed, whereby we are protected from having to engage militarily. But that there are also ways, Pat, as we both know, and you would know more than most, of pressure being put. But from my reading of it, that pressure wasn't put on Ireland. And I mean, it all depends on what happens with the war now. But I mean, the other way, I guess, of looking at things, and it has struck me, we're nearly a year in now, and there is incredible cohesion. There has been an amazing turnaround. Clearly, it's because there's a different president, but in US relations, and a repairing there. I mean, I was working on something today where I was thinking back about post-Brexit, and there was a time even when we had the presidential election in France, and the concern that the right-wing candidate Marine Le Pen would be elected, and that France could talk about leaving the EU. You look at it now, and it is very much a united front, and that has come about as a result of what has happened in Ukraine. I suppose you even look back, you put things in context. It was the EU getting together to collectively buy vaccines and being seen to be able to do that in a funny way, nobody could predict that we were going to go from a global pandemic to a war in Ukraine. But that gave gave us all, and the EU, I think, a sense of, well, we can do this. And now it's been done on a grand scale. So I guess if we are to take anything positive out of what is a horrible situation, it is that unity and that unity of purpose. Yes, we didn't have a bad winter. We didn't have a situation where you had Germany saying to France, or whatever, Luxembourg saying to Belgium, would you give us some of that gas that you have? It hasn't gotten that raw. But I think it's that aspect of it is definitely positive.
And I want to ask Pat about how the war is going for Ukraine. But one thing he had said, Kieran, which I would like to ask you about, was that the war has revived the multilateral system, whether it's the NATO, maybe not the UN, well, possibly the General Assembly, but the EU, the OSCE. When under Trump, for example, we saw basically the multilateral system almost falling apart, and this war is also a threat to it. Where do you see that going? Because that's quite worrying too.
I think on the multilateral stuff, just to go back to answer your question, but to go back to some of the stuff, I mean, we don't understand here how the global south see this war, which is very fundamentally different to how we see it. There was 2 votes in the General Assembly in the last 6 months. One was to recognise the war, to recognise the occupation. United States, Britain, Germany were going around the houses saying, you must back this. Overwhelmingly, countries backed it. There was a vote recently to send the Israeli occupation of the West Bank to the International Court of Justice. Those same countries that said back Ukraine on occupation, on invasion, were saying don't send Israel, don't send this sort of thing. The Global South think that issues of occupation, issues of Palestine, issues of this, that Europe is not on their side. And it's a really, that Middle East thing is really, really powerful. And they see the war in Ukraine through that prism. It's America and Europe looking after their own again against Russia. Russia give us wheat. Russia are nice to us. Russia are anti-colonial, and it's very, very deep. And we don't get that here. That's the first thing. Second thing is the multilateralism stuff. I mean, okay, the OSCE is in trouble because of what the war there. I mean, with Russia and all of that, and the EU is better. The UN system. It's the UN system. I mean, we're not going to get Russia out of the P5. It's just not. It's not the way it's set up. Below that, and what I work on is these regional multilateral frameworks, that there is an understanding now with climate change, with all of these things. You have to set up these multilateral frameworks. And we work with the German government on how to establish these around the world, on how to tackle issues like climate and all of that. Nobody is walking away from the UN. Nobody is saying, you know, we complain about the UN, and we understand that the UN has the power that the member states give it, and that's all it has, and it's dysfunctional. And I remember back in 2005, the Irish foreign minister was an envoy on UN reform. I remember there was 121 negotiation points on the Excel sheet, and 50 states we had to go and visit. The first 6 were on the Security Council. Every one we went to, people said, we're not talking about the first 6. That's just totally off. There's no point. There's just no point talking about that. So the UN has come through thick and thin. We're not going to go back to the 60s and the Renaissance and all of that sort of stuff, but it'll be there after the war, I've no doubt, and maybe we can make changes, but it won't be quick.
And international law itself, though, I mean, it looks like, forget it.
Forget it.
Right.
Absolutely forget it.
I was hoping for something a bit more optimistic.
Forget
Okay, Pat, look, how much of a game changer has the last week been in relation to tanks, in relation to a bigger even push to support Ukraine militarily?
Well, I'm not a military expert, but everything I read, everything I see says it is a significant addition, a game changer potentially for Ukraine, and not just in terms of organising defensive strategy, but potentially organising offensive strategy. I've little doubt, because this has been a moving target. Ukraine correctly always wants more and wants the next thing. I'm sure the next part of this will shift to aircraft after tanks, and it may, like the tank story, be reluctantly. It's like going to the dentist without an anaesthetic. Eventually the tooth might be pulled, but it's a lot sorer. We don't yet know the full Russian response, but it's widely expected that there will be a significant additional mobilization of Russian forces. That doesn't make them necessarily more effective on the ground to do with organisation and backup, but numbers do matter. We've seen in the Solidar and Bakhmut space that the endless waves, whether they were taken from the prisons or otherwise, of what are essentially regarded as expendable cannon fodder troops, keep pouring forward. And at some moment, sheer exhaustion in the capacity to defend. It may not even be human exhaustion, which would be entirely legitimate, but exhaustion of ammunition, exhaustion and cut off of supply chain in the right time and so on. This is a real issue. And I think there's a long tradition in Russia. If you go back to the Romanovs, they lost their power in the end because when they sent troops badly equipped to cope in the First World War, you began to get fellas going home and getting very rebellious, and they were a key driver of the Russian Revolution. If you take Joseph Stalin, anyone who's ever read the wonderful histories of Stalingrad, which was such a massive psychological and actual turning point in the war, Russian conscripts were sent in barges across the Volga into Stalingrad with all sorts of machine gun nests ranged against them, mowing them down while they were on the barges and ferries. They had no gun or no ammunition. This they had to pluck from the hands of the dead if they made it. And for those who wanted to step back to the barge, the political commissar was on board to shoot them dead in the back. So there are long Russian traditions of absolute indifference by its ruling elite to whatever the casualty rate will be. So count on the mobilization as meat grinder quality mobilization. Putin has all his skin in this game. I don't know what will happen about, there's all sorts of things about his health and surviving. A lot of it is wishful thinking. For so long as he's there, this guy started a game of poker and has put most of his big chips in, reputationally and politically. And we don't know what will be the escalation effects of tanks or of more victories by Ukraine. And there are many options that we see threatened and discussed, and we don't know whether those escalations will happen. But my feeling is that Putin has so much at stake that, like the gamble that he's taken and the gambler he now is, if there are any chips left, in the end, more likely than not, he will play them. And some of those chips could be quite devastating. It's a scenario. I don't say it as a prediction, but when a rat's wall is against the back, a story told by Mr. Putin in the biographies written about him, he knows that the rat jumps and strikes at you. And I think if he feels cornered, that could happen. A final comment, if the wishful thinking happened and Mr. Putin some way disappeared, don't presume that what follows is better. Russia could begin to cannibalize itself through its own national ethnicities. Russia could be taken over by an aggressive right-wing nationalist. Russia could become a failed state on our doorstep. So it's not that I'm for Putin, not at all. But whatever the not Putin alternative is, I don't know. But don't presume or predict that after Putin it gets better. There's a lot of issues to point in the direction that it even could get worse in neighbourhood terms.
Okay, does anyone want to make a comment or ask a question of the panel? Just give us your name and introduce yourself if you don't mind. Thank you.
My name is Carmen, and my question is basically how will becoming less dependent on Russia for energy deter them from continuing to push forward into Ukraine and potentially into these other buffer states, maybe even trying to get the USSR back together? How will reducing our dependence change that? If that makes sense.
I mean, everyone has a view. Very quickly, thank you for your question. I think, firstly, on the energy dependence thing, I think Mr. Putin is, the one thing we can thank him for is if we weren't already woken up to the need to shake off fossil fuel dependency and make a green transition, Mr. Putin has given us one of the best reasons in Europe to do it. So I think the energy transition question is now much more front and centre, not just because there's public policy and some legislation, but because the consciousness of releasing ourselves from dependency on an autocratic petro-state is now embedded. I think that's a big plus. I think to do with re-establishing the Soviet Union, Putin didn't quite have that, but he had an idea of the Commonwealth of Independent States, which didn't really work, but he hasn't lost the appetite. I'd say he's putting staggering pressure on Lukashenko in Belarus. He has invaded Ukraine, and he has shown he bared his teeth and his fist in Georgia. They've effectively occupied South Ossetia. They have, quote, peacekeepers in Nagorno-Karabakh and the Armenian-Azerbaijan border. They have threatened Transnistria in Moldova and saying if they got as far as Odessa, they would take Transnistria. So there's a very aggressive neo-imperialist drive in the Russian instinct. And if they got away with it, to come to your question, would they stop in Ukraine? I don't believe they would. If they got away with it, they see the three Baltic states as former Soviet republics, whose independence, of course, Stalin raped in 1940 in a dirty deal between Molotov and Ribbentrop on Russia and Nazi Germany's part. But that stuff is out there. He's been described very well by Bill Burns, the head of the CIA, as a man who was stewing in his own grievances. And I won't go into them, but you could write a book of grievances. And if you want to get them unembellished, but written probably by an academic with Putin's name added, go to the Kremlin website, take out whatever your language is, and check out an essay that he published, about 7,000 words, kind of saying why Ukraine was never a nation and why Russia had to take it back. And he talked about the Slavic Brotherhood. And he's now, on a daily basis, revealing what Slavic Brotherhood looks like if you choose to differ.
Thanks a million, Pat. And look, just very briefly, two concluding comments from both of our panelists. Kieran, I was going to ask you just, following on from what Pat said, the Ukrainian army, as opposed to the Russian army, is unbelievably motivated. It's a different type of army altogether. So that gives us some hope.
It does, and war is terrible, bad things, but war clarifies in an amazing way, and war is a very central part of nation building. And you can see now, read a couple of times and listened to philosophers talking on podcasts and stuff, Russia is looking to its past. Ukraine is looking to its future. Ukraine has a divided past. It has, even a year ago we had all this stuff about Russian speakers, non-Russian speakers, all this. Ukraine, all of our states, all of our nations, including Ireland, there was this period of invention of tradition back in the 19th century. Ukraine is going through this now. This is an amazing unifying, you hear British people talking about the Blitz in London. It is a unifying story they're going to tell about themselves. It's a forward-looking place. When you think of how militarily they have done in the last year, you remember Sky News and CNN and these amazing generals at the maps. They all said in 3 days and 4 days and 5 days, they will be up against the Dnieper. They may stop there, or else they may take out the president and negotiate.
Yeah,
and
like Afghanistan.
Exactly, and it didn't happen. And you know what? There's a spine there that we should all look up. And what's important for Europe going forward, and what the president did in Ukraine in the last couple of days about corruption. He took people out, he fired people, and you know this better than I do, Pat, but I remember going to Ukraine 15 years ago, and it was all businessmen and corruption and everywhere. And if they can do that as part of the story, so, 24th of February last year is sort of year zero for a new Ukraine, and you can see that before our eyes, so it's...
Alison, do you think Irish people, I mean, obviously you can't speak for all of Irish people, but do you think we're ready for the debate around better engagement when it comes to our security, and that the Irish people may be ahead of the politicians in this one?
Yeah, if I could just pick up briefly on what went ahead, that as a journalist and someone who works in communications, and this even just struck me again this morning, hearing that last night in his nightly address, President Zelensky obviously spoke about the issue of the thanks and their gratitude. And I found myself thinking, the nightly address, I wonder how many, if any, of those that he has missed. What a brilliant masterstroke they are. How incredible Ukraine has been on their communications strategy. How it has been global, how it has been cohesive, how it has been extraordinarily on message, and how there is an amazing academic study to be done afterwards on how responsible that has been in terms of even the announcement of these tanks, how at each step they have been ahead of it. The other week, my mother-in-law said, I can't remember which parliament, you think of the number of parliaments that he has beamed into, wearing his sort of fatigues, and my mother-in-law said, would that fella not put a shirt and tie on him when he's speaking before parliaments? And I said, that's not the point. Or the point is that this is a man, his country is at war. And it's even the symbolism of that, the imagery, and I think that is, and I guess naively, I thought at the start that Russia, you thought, this is a new kind of war. There's so much social media, there's TV channels, there's everything. What sway will that have on the Russians? And certainly at the start, and before we spoke earlier about the literally the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of soldiers that are now dying, that will have a sway on public opinion. But that I was thinking about it incorrectly. What I didn't know then was just how amazing Ukraine was going to be at that, and how a year in, how incredibly consistent they've been, and how this is a really new facet of modern warfare.
Okay, and thank you very much. And I think we could all hope that this time next year we're having a different conversation and a victorious Ukraine. But thank you so much to our amazing panel, Kieran O'Quinn, Pat Cox and Alison O'Connor.
I realise there are so many themes that have just come up, and I think just in imagining a title of energy security in a world of disinformation, sometimes that could potentially be quite limiting. Not for this panel. Each and every one of you could have taken that in 1,000,001 different directions, and it was a fascinating conversation. We're so deeply appreciative of our speakers being able to come here, in particular for Shona, for being able to manage that entire conversation. Just one last round of applause for all of our panellists. We are coming up on one of the moments that you've been waiting for. Clearly the panel was the first one, but the second one is our awards dinner with our awardees. And so we are very delighted tonight to be able to give some honours in the presence of you all, and some incredible speakers and guests that we have tonight. I implore you, we are going to go now shortly into the sidecar bar, where this entire room will be turned over for our dinner reception. We will have a sit down at 7:15. I think I said 7:15 earlier. Apologies for that. 7:15 is our sit down. If I could just ask, there is all of the board who are requisitioned to be able to be our mobilising force, our army tonight, to move you from the sidecar bar into dinner. I implore you, please do not allow us to do that. Please be in here at 7:15 if you could all help us with that. You can bring drinks even. There's literally, they serve them in here. So please do walk with us when we are going through that process. However, for now, thank you so much for being here. 7:15 is our next call time back in this room. And for now, from us, thank you so much. We will see you in the sidecar bar.